So what I will be talking about today is temporality and schizophrenia. Actually, what I wanted to present is actually this article that I've written with Thomas Fuchs, Time and Events. It's an article that is related to the publication of the EWE, so this examination of the anomalous world experience. I think most of what I will be presenting is actually Thomas Fuchs's work, and I've only edited a bit of the work. That was the goal, but then I tried to change it a little bit, and you will see that towards the end I come with some kind of maybe original thoughts on these. So. First of all, I think this is a very important point in phenomenological psychiatry, particularly when concerning psychosis or schizophrenia. So this is a quote of a Dutch philosopher, Wouter Custes, who experienced psychosis himself, who wrote a fantastic book about it, The Philosophy of Madness. And he writes, "The concrete concerns of the psychotic person are theoretical questions of the philosopher." And I have to say that when we were talking the past few days about time, the body, the other, all of these items and things and themes and so on can be found in conversations with psychotic people. Not all the time, of course. But to illustrate this concerning time, I have another quote of Rob Sips. He's a researcher, he's a philosopher in Leuven as well, who experienced psychosis himself a few times, and we are working together on the phenomenology of beginning psychosis, mainly based on qualitative research that he is doing and on his own experiences. Now, just as an illustration, I read this quote: "The entire world runs on a time that people have invented. They did this by seeing a certain logic in things, day, night, morning, evening, midday, half of a day. There is a recurrent logic in the way we reason about time. To really realize what time is, you arrive at the eternal questions," he writes. Namely, why does it become dark and light? In this you can go further again. Why does the sun move in front of the moon? And then I think you arrive at gravity. And then you can ask, why is there gravity? And then you can try to explain gravity. And like this you can keep on going until you're not able to grasp things anymore. Now, what this is the content, is temporality in the content of psychosis. He wrote this during the first psychotic episode actually. But this concerns the content, and this is not what I will be talking about today. I will be talking about more the structure, if I can use that word, of psychosis and the way temporality plays a role. But then I was reminded of something that happened to me a few days ago, actually Tuesday before I came here. And I was reminded, I had this association during the talk of Tom Freuze yesterday morning. And I wanted to read this to you because I think it's not a story, it's not fiction, it's pure clinical reality. And I think it helps, or it can help, to shed a different light on the temporality issue in schizophrenia. So I will read this again. "The day before coming to this conference, I was on guard, on duty, on call. I don't know the exact English term. In the psychiatric hospital where I'm working. I received a phone call late in the afternoon that there was a woman in the hallway, one of the long hallways of our hospital where normally almost nobody comes. She didn't react, they said to me. They didn't know who it was. So I went there, and when I arrived, I saw a woman completely alone at the end of the hallway. She must have been 40, 45 years old. There was a trolley next to her on the ground, the kind you see people take when they go to visit a market or shopping. Her jacket was laying next to her on the floor. She was leaning with her head, it seemed, against the glass door, her arms raised halfway in the air. I talked to her, explained to her who I was, but she didn't react. Her hands, I'm a bit confused with the text now, but her hands were completely cramped in unusual positions. She was standing there like something like this. She was catatonic, it was clear. And I noticed that she wasn't actually leaning against this glass door, but there was a space between her head and the door, which sometimes happens in catatonia. Her feet I saw were inverted. They were turned inside, and she was actually standing on the external sides of her feet. She must have been standing there for over half an hour. I didn't touch her. I told her I would try to search for someone who knew her, contact nurses from some of the wards I suspected her to be hospitalized in. I was thinking of, I don't know where I am anymore, but I was thinking of the emergency department in our hospital where, for example, catatonic people or people prone to catatonia are treated intensively. Or on the other hand, I was thinking of the departments for psychosis, particularly chronic psychosis, schizophrenia and the like. Her age, the way she looked, the catatonia, although I didn't really know who she was, I knew nothing about her, actually only this image and this body that was standing there. It was clear that she suffered from severe mental illness, particularly because of this catatonic state. I was thinking of schizophrenia or maybe bipolar disorder. And now I'm going to do something completely different, namely I'm going to stop this story and I'm going to come back to the story at the end of the presentation. I hope you can just remember this image of this person standing there. And it's not I think it's relevant for the discussion. So, what will I be talking about today? First of all, I'll give a short introduction to the psychopathology of time. Many of the talks in this presentation have already touched on the psychopathology of time, of course. Then I will talk about this distinction between implicit and explicit time that Thomas Fuchs has used in his work to clarify the phenomenology in schizophrenia. And then we'll talk about what kind of alterations to implicit and explicit time we can describe. And then, when you see, I wrote time and schizophrenia, how? Well, this question of how, this mysterious, what happens actually, is something that I'm trying to not solve, but come closer to with the story that I will continue telling. Okay, so first of all, I think most of you know Minkowski. He was a French, Polish psychiatrist. He had written a lot about temporality and psychopathology. And concerning schizophrenia, he describes first of all that there is a devenir, a becoming, a feeling of accompanying our experience, which he relates to the élan vital of Bergson. And he says that actually there's a unique rhythm common to us all and to the ambient becoming that makes me individually feel that I'm advancing in my life simultaneously with time. His famous notion of the vital contact with reality also includes this temporal dimension. And I wrote patient T. I have a patient in the ward where I was working last year, and he came every Friday on 3 o'clock. And I saw him for a year, and every Friday at 3 o'clock he was there. Even if I wasn't there, he was there. And we talked a bit, but he didn't really talk. But the only thing that we did was that we walked around in the hospital 10, 15 minutes, and that was it. But he kept on coming back to this moment where we were together, actually, where we shared a rhythm, his rhythm, because he walked very slowly. It's really like this, but we shared this rhythm. It was not me imposing my rhythm onto him. The interesting thing is that apart from this appointment with me, he did nothing. He sat on his couch. He didn't watch TV. He just sat there, and that is in fact still his life. Thomas Fuchs already talked about in a remark schizoidea, cycloidea. I will not go into detail. It's very interesting, but it would take us a bit too far. To conclude, Minkowski says, in schizophrenia we see a kind of desynchronization and a loss of resonance of this rhythm, this shared rhythm. There are others, of course, the famous Japanese psychiatrist Kimura who was here in the 60s or 70s, I think, in Heidelberg as well. He also wrote about lived time in similar ways as Minkowski, but what he did originally, I think, is introduce these ideas of the ante, intra, and post festum orientation. So it's an attitude, a temporal attitude that we may have, and he compares it to when you go to a party or a feast or a conference dinner like yesterday. And he relates this attitude to certain psychopathologies. For example, the post festum orientation concerns this idea of, well, as many of us may have, the party was yesterday, what did I do? Maybe I did something wrong, and it's too late now to do anything about it. I feel guilt. And in extreme forms, he relates this to melancholia. Interestingly, he also talks about what we would now call borderline personality disorder. And this intra-festum orientation is the constant now, now, now. It's all happening now. Of emotions, of identity. And one can see it if you work with these patients, that there can often be a disconnection to past experiences, a discontinuity to the self that I was before, to others, and they seem to be in constant need of reframing, of mentalizing, if I can use this term. Regarding schizophrenia, he used the concept of the ante-festum orientation. He talked about anxious anticipation, and I think this resonates strongly with what Matthew Radcliffe has written in his recent book on hallucinations, the role of anticipating and alienating of experience. But in Kimura, it's more of an ontological anxiety related to probably the Unheimlichkeit in Jaspers. And he says that it may have to do with the feeling of losing a stable self. Of course, you have Karl Jaspers, you have Ellenberg. Maybe I'll skip this a bit because it would take too much time. But the conclusion, or maybe just this quote, the last quote you see, is from a patient who said, "I sometimes experience a terrifying feeling of unrealness. Suddenly, I feel myself in the present, yet all connection to this present seemed cut off. I felt like waking up in a strange room, but the difference was that I lived in that room for months." Now, what I think that is, if you study the psychopathology of temporality concerning schizophrenia, you notice a lot of different, diverse, and sometimes contradicting ideas on what is it exactly, this phenomenology. And what is needed is a more thorough or detailed phenomenology of alterations of time in schizophrenia. And I say what is needed is what was needed, of course, because that's what I think Thomas Fuchs has done in his work. Several publications actually, namely, clarify this in much more detail. And he used the idea of implicit and explicit time to help clarify this. Implicit time, implicit temporality is the undercurrent of experience. It's to live time, it is bodily oriented, there's a commitment to the situation one is in. And there are two conditions for implicit temporality. On the one, of course, inner time consciousness. I will not go into detail, I think most of us know this. But then the other point, the second condition, so you have a structural of inner time consciousness, but then there's this other implicit dimension of temporality, namely this conative-affective tension, which is related to drive, to urge, to affection, and which resonates, or no, which makes spontaneity and affective directedness possible in the first place, that we all may be goal-oriented. It can be related to the élan vital of Bergson, and it could be a vital factor to experience self-affection and the feeling of being alive. These two things, on this implicit level of temporality, so the structure of inner time consciousness, the direction of affect and drive, make it possible for identity to exist of objects and of the self, in fact, of the subject experiencing this. If you have implicit temporality, you also have explicit temporality. Sean Gallagher already talked about this. We can experience time as explicitly there, as segmented in these moments of no more and not yet. Time can be experienced as finite, as independent, as an inexorable power. And in a way, one could compare on the implicit level in the structure of inner time consciousness, this idea of protension, urimpression, and retention, to, on this explicit level, the past, the present, the future, in that they have to be synthesized in a certain way. There's a continuity between these. And this is where the narrative self, or narration in general, comes in. This, on the other hand, links us then to intersubjective temporality, where we create narratives for ourselves, with others, and for others as well. And then there's an interesting point, I think, namely the last point on this slide, artifacts of time. What are artifacts of time? Well, a clock, a watch, a calendar, a timetable, and so on. They help us attune to others. They make it possible that everybody was here on time, that we have things, conferences, conversations, that we can do things together. But they do much more. They determine or help to determine reality. Because if we wouldn't have timetables, historical calendars, it would be, or it could be, difficult to determine whether what we experienced was actually a fantasy, a story that we tell, or whether there was some kind of truth, or whether it was even a fact that certain things happened. It could also be that these artifacts help to avoid madness, or the feeling of madness, of being overwhelmed by a completely chaotic being, by imagine not having temporality in this explicit sense, not having these clocks, these timetables. I think one can intuitively grasp that this could come close to what some psychotic people experience. And furthermore, I think what we do in psychiatric wards, for example, for psychotic people, is restructuring all the time. And the goal, I think, is resynchronizing and re-socializing in different ways, of course. But on this temporal level, we also do it by saying, we get up at 8, we eat at 9, at 10 the therapy starts, and so on, which seems trivial maybe to some, but I think it really helps to structure and restructure temporality and give some kind of idea of controllability of something that in fact is not controllable. Well, let us turn to schizophrenia. So what is Thomas Fuchs, what has he written about it? Very simplified, of course, there is a problem with protension. He uses the idea of the cone of probability as the figure that you can see here, where protension actually, or this cone of probability, determines which possible experiences are there for us to emptily anticipate. And this is informed or motivated by our impression at the moment, our retention at the moment, and so on. And it has been extensively analyzed that some of the first rank symptoms, some of the key symptoms in schizophrenia, passivity experiences and so on, could be related to this. Again, I will not go into detail, but just to explain this a bit. For example, imagine if you see the structure of inner time consciousness. If experiences are not potentially anticipated or differently anticipated in a way, because this cone is either too wide or too narrow, but still experienced in the Urimpression and in the retention, this could be possibly a description of what happens in an intrusion or in a thought insertion. And if you would think this true, this could lead to hallucination or even to transcendental depersonalizations or a loss of the sense of self. Although I have to say that this account, because I talked about Radcliffe's book earlier, I think it doesn't really match with the account of the idea of anticipation. If in this book you read that anticipation can play a different role, that anticipation itself, anxious anticipation, can create alienation and objectivation of experiences, thereby also creating hallucinations, thereby also creating thought insertion. But I'll leave it up to you, of course, to see who is right, of course. So the weakening of the protension, well, one can wonder, are there other disorders, mental disorders, where this implicit temporality could be disturbed? And we already saw that affective disorders, depression, mania, and so on, could be included in this list. Well, for example, we see a retardation or an acceleration, but it seems that they are more related to this cognitive dynamic rather than an affective tension, rather than to the structure of inner time consciousness, as we see no fragmentation, no discontinuity of experience. So the structure seems to remain intact. It is only the things that are related to goal directedness, velocity, drive that seem to change. Then, of course, what are the alterations in explicit temporality? There are many. I just name a few. In this pre-psychotic phase, thank you, we can see this anticipatory, anxious feeling of the impending future. During psychosis, some people describe the standstill of time. And in the post-psychotic period, things like the negative symptoms can be understood in the same way as well. When I talked about this patient who was walking that slowly, and who I saw every Friday at 3 o'clock, I think he's the perfect example of this post-psychotic loss of explicit or changed explicit temporality. There's a complete loss of drive. He didn't do anything. He was completely inactive. There was complete social withdrawal. And in fact, the first time that you see this person, you think he's severely depressed, but he isn't. There is no affective disorder to speak of. Now, there are two mechanisms, compensation and decompensation, that you can see in, I think, mostly chronic psychotic disorders. And that is that people create a kind of idiosyncratic temporality, their own temporality that is not shared anymore. For example, delusions from a temporal perspective could be understood as a kind of retemporalization within a narrative, so explicitly, of something that, following Thomas Fuchs, concerns actually implicit disintegration of inner time consciousness. Compensation often leads to decompensation, and we see then that patients withdraw, minimize change in their lives, search for repetition and monotony. And this goes exactly for the patient I was talking about. It seems one could suggest that this is kind of a substitute for a lack of inner continuity and stability that one searches in the complete monotony of the surroundings. So, to almost end my presentation, clearly the phenomenology of schizophrenia has shown a lot, that there is disturbed self-experience, that there is disturbed intersubjectivity, disembodiment, and so on, and also that one could think of it as disturbed inner time consciousness. The question is, how? What happens? And it is here that I would like to return to the scene that I was describing earlier. So you remember this woman at the end of the hallway, completely alone. She didn't react, her eyes were closed, I couldn't reach her at all. She was completely catatonic. And I thought she would have been either schizophrenic, maybe bipolar, I didn't know. So I'll continue the story. What I did was I called around to different wards, nurses, therapists in the hospital. Finally, someone could tell me that it was probably Kay, who had an appointment with her therapist earlier. It was not the first time she got lost after a session, so I talked to her therapist. She was not simulating, what you might have thought maybe. She was not psychotic, nor schizophrenic. She was not diagnosed as bipolar. She wasn't, in fact, chronically ill. She has a job, she functions well, and it was not the first time that this happened. In fact, what I saw there was preceded by a session of trauma therapy, EMDR, where Kay relives parts of these past traumatic experiences in a safe way. I learned that normally nurses of the somatic center of our hospital, they take care of her, they keep an eye out for her after these sessions. She has a room where she can stay for a few hours, and then she goes home. I was completely baffled by this experience. I was baffled by the severity of the clinical picture, this image that I saw in relation to the reliving of this traumatic origin. I was baffled mostly because of the enormous difference between this woman that she is and this object-like figure that I found, who seemed to have lost her way, her fluidity, her mobility, her connection to others, whose body shut down, closed up, for whom the laws of gravity or physiology seemed not to apply. She was unreachable and untouchable. It seems to me as if, from the perspective of temporality that we are now talking about, it seems to me as if the potential openness, this cone of probability, which is linked to the essential capacity of openness to intersubjectivity, to otherness, to others, and thus to experience in general, it seems indeed that this cone was closed abruptly, as if she was on her way home and suddenly disclosed. It is as if her whole object-like body expressed this impossibility to experience, when experience itself is unbearable. The impossibility to experience the other when the threat of the other is unbearable. In this clinical experience, I see a motivation to think of the structural or transcendental disturbances, be it closing of protension or altered modalities of intentionality for that matter, that we could describe in schizophrenia or in this example, as essentially dynamic and connected to the concrete world, to the trust we develop in relation to and with others. This allows for affection to be touched, yet it equally implies fragility and vulnerability. Thank you.